I wanted to give you a heads up, though, on what's coming. Tonight we're going to be looking at the book of Isaiah in not a whole lot of detail, but enough that I hope you'll appreciate that it lays a bit of a foundation for our book of Revelation. And then likewise, next week we'll be looking at another prophet, this time Daniel. I've not decided yet. It's going to be a big decision whether or not I want to have two classes on that. Or only one. And again, in slides that are about to come, you'll see why I would want to spend more time in Daniel. But we're going to have, at least two classes and maybe a third class, two of them on Daniel and one tonight, before we come to what is the next best time to get started in this Revelation series. It's been very encouraging. Each and every week I'm getting emails and phone calls, people that are commending this. I understand at least one place in Africa these are being broadcast now, and so it's kind of spreading outside the United States even. But I've mentioned to you that there are 3 times that you might want to check in, or someone would be able to come into this book of Revelation without feeling like they were already in over their heads. The first, of course, is with the first class, and they're all being recorded, so you can go back and look at those. But the second best time, and one that's very critical for your friends that you may be encouraging to join us, will come up after I get done with Isaiah and Daniel. When we get into Matthew chapter 24, we're going to be spending at least 3 weeks and as many as 5. We'll just see how I'm feeling those nights. As a last discussion about the Bible's prophecies, and dare I say the Bible's Old Testament prophecies. Jesus has not yet died. He has not yet risen from the dead in Matthew 24. The new covenant has not yet been inaugurated. And so here is a prophecy in the mouth of the Son of God that is set forth while under the old law, while the Jewish old law for those Jews exclusively is still in effect. So in Matthew 24, as we look at that Old Testament prophecy, we're going to see, as we will starting tonight in Isaiah and especially in Daniel, that the correlations with Revelation are just very many. They're very obvious. They're quite important foundationally to understanding the book of Revelation. But if a person comes into this class just when we get going with Matthew 24, they will have gotten this idea, not to the same degree, not in its fullness, but at least if they start with Matthew 24, I believe they'll have a very solid foundation that they can build on in Revelation. Of course, we'll hope they'll join us, whether they get the introductory material or not, and could come in when we start with Revelation chapter 1 and be fine too. But I just wanted to encourage you to continue to tell people about it. Hopefully this will spread, and we're going to have folks coming in while they can really get a very strong basis and understanding of the Old Testament by which they can better understand our book of Revelation. And then lastly, I understand that across cyberspace there's a great debate that is raging. Apparently this was first raised because of the chats. But I wanted everybody to know that my mugs are not Disney mugs. I'm not pretending to be Aladdin, but rather one of the Beatles here. As a matter of fact, I've got a collection of about 4 Beatles mugs, I guess, that you might see going by. So be that as it may, rest assured, not Disney stuff at least. That'll bring us here then to yet another photograph of the city of Jerusalem. I particularly like this one. You are looking at that shallow V of a wall in the foreground there toward the bottom, well lit as it is. The sun is setting. You can see the shadows now falling toward the east over Jerusalem in this photograph. But you can also really quite clearly see the extent of what is called the Old City, the city in the time of Christ. And so here are the walls that have been built upon through the ages that are on the foundations, much of it from actually 2,000 years ago, even beyond Solomon's time, some of them. And you can see there then in the shadow up toward the top of the screen. The Kidron Valley is just perfectly in that shadow. The Mount of Olives with its three towers there in the due east of the city and across the Kidron from the eastern wall is very prominent. This city, I labored last week to demonstrate, though I didn't actually come out and say it. I'm saving my punchline for right now. This city matters to God in his entire redemptive plan from Genesis chapter 3 until the end of time, whenever that may be, perhaps long after you and I have shuffled off this mortal coil. That city has mattered to God, has mattered to God in a variety of ways that we studied last week, and has enormous precedence, a much higher priority in God's thinking and in God's unfolding plan than Rome ever did. We'll find Rome in the book of Daniel particularly. We'll find Rome in Matthew 24. We'll certainly find Rome when we get into the study of Revelation itself, particularly in chapter 13, just to kick it off. But Rome's figuring in God's plans is relatively incidental. They're a big deal. I understand that. They're a big deal in the physical world, but not in God's plans for saving mankind from their own sins. And so it certainly would take precedence, I think, in God's unveiling of his relationship to this city, that we would much more likely have 22 chapters in the last book of our Bibles dealing as a summary, and as I've entitled the class, a grand finale to our entire Bible and to God's entire redemptive scheme. We would much, more likely have Jerusalem featured prominently in that book and its consequences for accepting or rejecting its Messiah, rather than spending 22 chapters talking about Rome. Rome didn't figure that highly in Daniel's prophecy or in Matthew's prophecy, but Jerusalem surely does. So here is that city right there. And as we zoom in now to this photograph of the Temple Mount, those 36 acres, we are in this photograph looking straight through the Dome of the Rock there to the south and to the east. So you see just a very bare minimum of the Mount of Olives there on the left. And this is then the very center of God's plans for the redemption of mankind, in that, for the sake of the Jews and the 39 books of the Old Law and the 4 of the Gospels, when that Old Covenant was still in effect, this is the center where the old temple stood, 50% taller than this structure, very much larger, in all directions on a two-dimensional plane. Right here, where Solomon began it and where Jesus would end it, stood a temple that had been through many permutations. It had been destroyed and remodeled and had grown to its fullest extent under the 46 years of Herod's administrations. Well, he started the 46 years, not completed till after his death. But this, the center of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, is the focus of God's plans in Scripture, and I'm quite certain the focus of God's prophecies in the Revelation. So let's take a look at this now. Here's quotations. I looked up a number of different articles through the years. I don't know actually the author on this one, but he said, no book of the New Testament is so thoroughly steeped in the thought and imagery of the Hebrew Scriptures. Revelation, no book in the New Testament so steeped in that imagery. Yet, the Old Testament is never explicitly quoted in Revelation, but is continually echoed and reapplied, is the term that he uses. And we'll be seeing that extensively here beginning tonight and in the next few classes that are to come. The book of Revelation, has more quotes from the Old Testament than any other book in the New Testament. But the book of Revelation never has a statement so closely lifted verbatim from the Old Testament that you could put quotes around it as you're reading the book of Revelation as being a direct citation from the Old. They get awfully close, and they come in varying degrees of verbatim, perfect match, but never quite. And that's just a curiosity. But it is such a strong correlation. Certainly, what those passages that are clearly being referred to in Revelation meant to the prophet who first uttered these ideas in the Old Testament, to those who first received those images as the prophets were living and producing them, and to all of the Jews and then the Christians down to this day who have been reading those Old Testament passages. It's clear. If you don't understand them in the Old Testament, it's not very likely you're going to understand them in the New. Now, it continues, of the 404 verses in the book of Revelation, this particular author says 278 make some allusion to the Old Testament. And that's 68.8% of all the verses in the book of Revelation. Let that sink in for a minute. 2/3 of the book of Revelation is somehow quite directly drawing its imagery, its concepts, its ideas, and its principles from the Old Testament. Better get that Old Testament, under your feet pretty clearly, even pretty firmly, before you try to take on the book of Revelation. This is why I think it was probably this book of Revelation, a great deal more of a revelation to the saints of the first century than it's proven to be in the next 2,000 years. We just don't spend the time with the Old Testament that we ought to, that we need to, that they had in days gone by to get the gist, and maybe in their case, in days gone by, it's just been automatic, say, well, of course, that's such and such a passage. I know what that means. Most, he continues in the quote, of these references to the Old Testament are from Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zechariah. And now you see what I said in the introduction. We're going to look at Isaiah tonight, probably 2 classes at least in Daniel. We'll probably not look at Zechariah at all, and I'm still trying to decide on Ezekiel. This quote, I believe, comes from another author, and once again, I wasn't able to get the attribution there, but he says more than half of these references, 278, one author suggests, more than half of them are from Psalms, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. But note, in proportion to its length, Daniel's only got 12 chapters, it's Daniel that yields the most. And the greatest number of revelations referencing the Old Testament come from not only the book of Daniel, but from Daniel chapter 7 and verse 1, and thereabouts in the context. Now, pardon me while I cough. Sweet, another excellent Bible student, says that there are 46 references to Isaiah. I've also seen 49 often cited, 31 to Daniel, 29 to Ezekiel, and then 27 to the Psalms. Well, once again, I don't want to belabor the point either, so we're not going to look likely at Ezekiel or the Psalms. But we're going to spend some time here in these 46 references to Isaiah and then also to Daniel. And we're going to start right here. Now, here's another view of the Temple Mount. In this case, I've cropped the photograph so that the bottom of the screen runs just right along the top of the eastern wall. The photographer is standing on the Mount of Olives, looking again into a sunset over the city of Jerusalem. And so you can see that the hill to the west, as you would be heading off eventually to the Mediterranean Sea, has a slight rise, for the city, so that it is kind of a bowl. And from all directions, really, around the city, you can look down on the place where God's name and God's presence was set by him under the Old Testament. But now let's just superimpose over this same picture for a while tonight. Isaiah chapter 2, which we ended with last week. In Isaiah chapter 2's first 3 verses, and again, I edit a little bit. I'll take a word like that out when I can still get the gist of the sentence, but you can look it up for yourself. Largely, it's all here on the screen. This is the word that Isaiah saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. I put that in caps. I put it in red. I put it, with an underline, because he tells you what he's talking about. He's not talking about New York. He's not talking about Paris or Berlin. He's certainly not talking about Moscow or China. He's talking about Judah and Jerusalem. Continuing, Isaiah said, it will come about in the last days. Now stop. This prophecy is about what? It's about Judah and Jerusalem in the last days. What do you think that phrase, the last days, meant to an Old Testament prophet? Well, we know for a fact, thanks to the New Testament, that they didn't often understand what they were prophesying even. Well, okay, and I think they understood some of it. In the last days, what would that expression mean to the people to whom the prophecy was given and who were therefore intended to understand it? What did it mean to the Jews throughout those centuries, 700 years Isaiah's writing at least, before the time of the coming of our Messiah? What was Isaiah talking about would take place in the last days concerning Judah and Jerusalem? Well, he said in those last days about Judah and Jerusalem, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established in those last days, will be established as the chief of the mountains, and will be raised above the hills. All the nations, that's the word for Gentiles, the non-Jews, not just the Jews, but also Gentiles. What would that mean to an Old Testament prophet exclusively dealing with Jews, not so much the Gentiles? What would it mean to the Jews to whom this prophecy was given? That concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the last days, all the nations would stream to it. That many peoples, not just the one people, the Jews, many peoples will say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, sorry about that errant red period there, may teach us concerning his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. 4. Now here's the point of all that. He's now explaining what it means, what he's talking about in Judah and Jerusalem in the last days. At that time in the last days, the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Isaiah begins in chapter 2 with a prophecy of the last days. So is he talking about things that haven't happened yet? Is he talking about the end of the planet, the solar system, the universe? The last days of what? Well, it appears to me that this is a prophecy about Judah and Jerusalem and not the entire universe. It's limited by God. Let us not feel that we have some right to add to the scriptures. Well, but it also means this, and it's dual prophecy, that very common phrase you never find in scripture, so that we can make this mean whatever we want to and apply it to us today if we want to. Well, I don't think Isaiah 2 was doing that. This is about Judah and Jerusalem in the last days when the law goes forth from Zion and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. The last days is when the new covenant came. The last days was when the gospel went forth. The last days, when this new religion, which is the fulfillment of the Jews' old religion, is born. When it begins, not when it ends, when it starts, as it issues forth into all of planet Earth. For what we now know has been 20 centuries of this new law that emanates from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Now look at this in Isaiah chapter 2. Here's something Isaiah also says in that second chapter. We're going to look at chapter 2, verse 10 and verse 11. In case you didn't know, whenever you see a scripture reference and it adds one little f, that stands for following. Verse 10 and the one following verse with one f be verses 10 and 11. Just a short way to say that. If it were 10 and FF, you'll see sometimes two Fs, that means more than one verse following to the end of the thought, and you get to pick when the end of that thought is. In this case, it's just verses 10 and 11, so just 10 and a single F. And we're also going to look at verse 17. Quote from Isaiah 2. Enter the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty. The proud look of man will be abased, and the loftiness of man will be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. In the last days of something that was coming to an end, and in the beginning of those last days, however long those last days, would transpire, it was all beginning when the law goes forth from Zion. In that same day, from verses 1 through 3 in Isaiah 2. In a note in parenthesis, I put there that last sentence is found in both verse 10 and in verse 17. The proud look of man will be abased, the loftiness of man will be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted. In that day, in those last days. Well, brethren, I'm not so sure that we were supposed to think of those last days as already enduring for 2,000 years. We'll have much to say about that as we get deeper into these prophets, and especially when we get into Matthew chapters 23 and 24. So before we go any further tonight, here's my homework assignment for you and for the next several weeks. Please be reading Matthew 23 and Matthew 24 regularly, more than once a day if you can, every day. Read Matthew 23 and Matthew 24. Read those two chapters and then ask yourself as this time goes by in the next few weeks, as you read especially Matthew 24 and verse 3, there are two questions you need to resolve, two questions you want to be certain you have the correct answer to. The first of these questions is, and employing the word questions in the question, the first of these questions is, how many questions did the disciples ask Jesus there on the Mount of Olives as they looked down at the very scene that you can see on the bottom of this slide? Let me go full screen for you for just a second there. As they looked right down at that and saw a much larger temple, okay, how many questions in Matthew 24 did they ask? Critically important. I won't even tell you how many are possible. I will tell you that essentially all Bible students are divided into two camps. Pick your camp. And once you do, premillennialism, that horrifying false doctrine which has misled millions through the millennium since Christ, it's not all that new in the 1800s, but especially in these last 200 years, premillennialism lies down one road, but something else lies down the road of your answering that question with a different number. How many questions in Matthew 24, verse 3? Everything depends on it. And then number two, ask yourself, do these questions in Matthew 24, verse 3, do they speak of one topic, two topics, three topics, more topics? These questions, are they all on the same theme? Are they all about a single thought, idea, concept? Or are they about two very different things? Events being foretold that would be thousands of years apart, let's just say. What is it? How many questions? How many topics? I'll leave those with you for these next couple of weeks, and I'll add a third one, and then we'll dig into it when we get to Matthew 24. And really, I think everything in understanding Revelation will finally, sort itself out if you can just get Matthew 24 figured out to begin with. Let's press on here, though. Also in Isaiah chapter 2, in verse 20 and 21, it continues the theme of the same time frame. It is multiple days. It is some length of time. The question is Is it a week, a month, a year, a decade, a century, a millennium? What last days? The last days of what? What was coming to an end and what was being born? And in that same day, so now it's plural in one case, it's singular in another. So you could talk about my grandpa's days, or you could talk about my, great-grandpa's day, and we mean exactly the same thing, singular or plural, back in a particular time frame. Men will cast away the moles and the bats, their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they made for themselves to worship, in order to go into the caverns of the rocks and the clefts of the cliffs, before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty, when he arises to make the earth tremble. Well, the trembling of the earth, that's just got to be the end of the planet, right? That's just got to be the shaking of the foundations of creation, doesn't it? I'll just tell you very confidently, no, it doesn't have to mean that at all. It could mean something else. And we might first try to figure out what the prophet was saying and what his listeners might have understood about it and what God wants us to understand about it, because this prophecy was meant to be understood. We just want to make sure we get it right. So in Isaiah 2, now I'll leave you with that, as these weeks go by too. Just in that one chapter, early in Isaiah, we've got these last days to deal with. Look at all the clues there and see if it will help you to reach one decision or another about what that time frame might be. Look up in your private studies, the last days and the last day, as that expression occurs in other places in the Old Testament and the New. Now, let's go a little deeper in Isaiah. Let's get into Isaiah chapter 11 now. Isaiah 11, verses 1 and 2, and then verses 4 and 5. I've smushed them together here. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be the belt about his loins, and faithfulness the belt about his waist. In parenthesis, in italics, I put Revelation chapters 1 and 2 and 19 all have, as the previous author said, echoes of this passage that you can see reverberating down the centuries into the prophecy of the book of Revelation. Who will strike the earth? With the rod of his mouth. Often in Revelation also with a sword of his mouth. With the breath of his lips, the wicked are slain. Righteousness is associated with this individual, whoever he may be, as a belt around his loins, and of faithfulness also, that belt. So again, here are overtones. Here are, shades where you can say, well, it's not a quote, but immediately, if you knew Isaiah, and now you're reading Revelation in the first century, the people to whom it was given, and it was a revelation, not a mystery to them, you just might be thinking, well, we've been studying Isaiah for a long time. And maybe Isaiah can help us to limit our, extremely active imaginations, how tremendously ingenious we are to come up with interpretations and meanings and speak with great authority, this means that. Now, I prefer to stick to a this means that when I have it in the mouth, for instance, of an inspired apostle at verse 16 of Acts 2, let's say. And so, let's just, tonight, I'm not really answering the question so much as just saying, look at the wealth of information we have in Isaiah that we'll also find in Revelation. Here's chapter 13 in Isaiah. We're going to look at verses 4 and 5, verse 6, verses 8 and 9, verses 10 and 11, and then in verse 13. And once again, with great condensation, I've truncated it immensely, taken a lot of these verses out. But again, you just, make it a composite out of all of it here. The Lord of hosts is mustering the army for battle. Ever read about an army being mustered in Revelation? They're coming from a far country. Ever read about an army coming from a far country in the book of Revelation? Wail, the day of the Lord is near. They will be terrified. Pains and anguish will take hold of them. They'll ride like a woman in labor. Ever hear about people weeping and lamenting and being tormented in the book of Revelation? The day of the Lord is at the end of the universe, the planet, or something else. Let's find out what it refers to repeatedly in the Old Testament and then see if we can figure out what it means in the Revelation. And continuing now. The day of the Lord is coming, cruel, with fury, burning anger, to make the land a desolation. And word desolation is going to matter to us a lot in forthcoming weeks. A whole lot in forthcoming weeks. He will exterminate its sinners from it. That almost sounds like somebody else might be left behind. Yeah. Who gets left behind once the sinners are exterminated, but the others aren't? He will exterminate its sinners from it. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises. The moon will not shed its light. Thus I will punish the world for its evil. Well, whoa, Larry, doesn't it say world? There's only one way to understand that word. It has to mean the planet. Oh, yeah? Well, yeah, I know. Jimmy Swaggart would say that. Jimmy Baker would say that. Some of the greatest scandals in history in the mouths of these televangelists and the rest of those false prophets of today who have bilked millions that they had enslaved to these lies have taught that stuff and then been busted. What? Well, hey, how about this? Let's not take the word of modern day uninspired people. Let's spend a lot of time, number of weeks are coming, and look at the Old Testament prophets and how they used these things. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. God ever used that expression before? The sun will be dark when it rises. The moon will not shed its light. Do we have any parameters and explanations and interpretations anywhere else? Thus I will punish the world for its evil. How is that word world used? How many words for world even are there in Hebrew and in Greek? Continuing now in verse 13, I'll make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken from its place at the fury of the Lord of hosts in the day of his burning anger. And Larry, that just can't possibly refer to anything but the end of the planet, right? Well, most people think so. Most people don't really seem to read the verses before and around and after those that we just read in the same chapter. Verse 1 of chapter 13 had also said that this is an oracle concerning Babylon. It is limited to Babylon. It is only about Babylon. It's not talking about anybody else. Nothing is said about a dual fulfillment. These words, can mean opposite things about some other city 2,000 years from now. The way Schofield put it into the Schofield Reference Bible in his footnote on Luke 21, none of that garbage is to be found in Isaiah 13. He just says it's about Babylon. And he leaves it to you to decide if you're going to add to the Word of God or take away from it. He also says, I'm going to stir up the Medes against them, and Babylon, the glory of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. God is going to do to Babylon, at the hands of the Medo-Persian Empire, something very similar to what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. The passage says is going to happen. It also adds, it'll never be inhabited or lived in. Well, wait a minute. How can there be generations to come when we just destroyed the whole planet? Because after all, Larry's cherry-picked verses that the guys who wrote the Left Behind books are so fond of, they seem to talk about the end of the planet. Now Larry's reading these other verses which limit it to the physical destruction of Babylon at the hands of the Medes and Persians, after which there will be generation after generation when Babylon is desolate. But there still is a location, Because now reading still from verses 19 through 22, also in Isaiah 13, desert creatures will lie down there. Their houses will be full of owls. Ostriches also will live there. Shaggy goats will frolic there. Hyenas will howl in their fortified towers, and jackals in their luxurious palaces. I'll tell you what, Babylon was destroyed by the Medes and Persians, and that's how I know that Isaiah was a prophet of God, because his prophecy was fulfilled. Maybe we ought to leave it at that. In Isaiah 34, verses 2 through 4. I got to check the time here. How am I doing? Oh, great. Okay. Isaiah 34. Let's skip on a little later now. Verses 2 through 4, and then verses 8 through 10. Once again, I've eliminated intervening verses and also even phrases and sentences, in these various things. You go read the whole context. But 34, 2 through 4, and then 8 through 10. The Lord's indignation is against all the nations. His wrath is against all their armies. He's utterly destroyed them. All the host of heaven will wear away. The sky will be rolled up like a scroll. Its streams will be turned into pitch, and its loose earth into brimstone, and its land will become burning pitch. It will not be quenched night or day. Its smoke will go up forever. Now, brethren, I'm not going to have time in this class, to go through all of the word meanings. What does forever mean? What does perpetual mean? When those words are used with regard to the Levitical law and the high priesthood, we don't think they're talking about eternity, do we? Yes, context matters. What's the context in Isaiah 34? Who's the Lord's indignation against? Whose armies is his wrath against? When they're utterly destroyed, the host of heaven wears away, the sky's rolled up, and streams are turned into pitch and that burns. Is it the end of a planet or something else? Well, 34 also says, that's the theme for tonight, Paul Harvey's rest of the story. Here's Isaiah 34, verses 5 and 6, verse 11, verse 17, verses 19 through 22, condensed and amalgamated. My sword is satiated in heaven, satisfied, full. That sword can't drink any more blood. It's got all it can take. Behold, it shall descend for judgment upon Edom. The Lord has sacrificed in Basra, sometimes spelled with an S instead of a Z, and always referring to the capital city of Edom. And a great slaughter in the land of Edom. Pelican and hedgehog will possess it. Owl and raven will dwell in it. He will stretch over it the line of desolation, the plumb line of emptiness. They shall possess it forever. From generation to generation they will dwell in it. Brethren, there's eternal life in heaven. There is no marriage or giving in marriage. We're like angels. There are no babies being born to produce new generations. And when we go to heaven, when we study the passages in our New Testament which do speak of a future judgment on the entire planet Earth, ending in the destruction of all the universe, in the contexts of our Bibles which demand a universal planetary and all creation physical universe destruction, well, then that's what it means in that context. But not in Isaiah 34, because we got generation after generation going on afterwards to prove that the prophet predicted a truth which was realized in physical history, and when it was, demonstrated that the Spirit of the living God used the mouth of Isaiah, who, by the way, prophesied at least 40 years, and some suggest for 60, that most prolific, that prince of all prophets, that many think just the best prophet to read you can find. He was not talking about the end of the world in Isaiah 34, no matter what those Left Behind books say, no matter what Hal Lindsey continues to say. He was talking about Edom, because that's what Isaiah said. That's what God told Isaiah to say. Let's go to Isaiah 49. This will be the last of the prophecies in Isaiah that we're going to develop to any extent here tonight. In Isaiah 49 now. So we've just been going through the book, leaping over chapters. In Isaiah 49 and verse 10. So here's one nice full verse, that I haven't stripped of all of its nuances. Much more full. Be sure you read these other passages. It's so much better when you read the rest of it. I mean, I just gave you the barest bones. When you go back now and you read these whole chapters, you just go, wow, how can anybody miss this? Well, brethren, they miss it because the Hal Lindseys, and the Jerry Jenkins, and what was that guy's name? I forget his name now. That was the actual author of the Left Behind stuff, because they do the cherry picking, because they do the interpreting that Isaiah would never dream of doing. So now, if you look at it all in context and you just have an open mind that just says, what is the prophet saying and what is the prophet not saying? And when he doesn't say something that I believed all my life that I thought he did, and now I'm reading the whole chapter. Maybe I ought to give up my preconceived notions and go by what the prophet said and sell it not for anybody. They will not hunger or thirst, Isaiah 49:10 says. When? Nor will the scorching heat or sun strike them down. When is that? He who has compassion on them will lead them and will guide them to springs of water. Now, I know you must have read Revelation at least once. And when you do, this ending of hunger and thirsting, this no longer having to deal with scorching heat and sun, and stroke, we all look forward to that. It'd be wonderful. He'll lead them and guide them to springs of water. Well, I wonder if there are springs of living water, seems I read somewhere, and they only exist in heaven. Is that what I read elsewhere in my Bible? When perhaps in the mouth of Jesus, he's referring to these old passages. In Isaiah 49:10, it's real easy to say, heaven, 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 there's no earth, there's no universe, it's all over, Revelation's done. Isaiah 49:10, it's talking about going to heaven. Well, is it? Is that what Isaiah was talking about? And when you see such close imagery in Revelation, is that what Revelation's talking about? Oh, wait. The rest of the story. In Isaiah 49, it also says 2 and 3, verse 6, verse 8, and then 19 through 22. I know I'm going to be accused of just, being the worst kind of cherry picker there ever was. But look, I'm telling you exactly where this is. I'm just combining it for you by stripping it apart and rearranging it so that you can see how the cherry pickers totally fail. Let me do some cherry picking here. But I'm going to cherry pick it in a way that keeps all the cherries in the same basket. When they cherry pick it, they got baskets all over time and space. Just put them in baskets that, are counties and states and continents apart. And so that's what Isaiah does. He has made my mouth like a sharp sword. Have I ever read about a sword of a mouth somewhere? He said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will show my glory. Who is the great suffering servant Israel in the book of Revelation? I will make you, that person, a light of the nations, plural, so my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Not a word is said about Mercury on one end, or Mars on the other, or Pluto. I'm going to keep it as a planet no matter what those scientists say. That's what I was taught in grade school. It's my story and I'm sticking to it. I'll make you a light of the nations. Well, there must be nations. So my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Well, it must still be an earth. In a favorable time I've answered you. In the day of salvation I've helped you. I'll give you for a covenant of the people to do what to the land? To atomize it? To vaporize it? To annihilate it? To end it? Or to restore it? Restore the land. Who's the land going to be given to? To whom will it be restored? Who is its possessor now? Well, brethren, it's when we get this new servant who is a covenant for the peoples, plural. It's when that happens. It's in those days. Might even be the last days of the thing Isaiah was talking about, not the last days of the planet. So I'll leave you tonight. What have I got? 12 minutes. That means I'm going to cut free tonight a little bit early. Here's a chart. I'm going to be handing it out, sending it electronically, so you can look for that later. If you want to write me at larry@truthondis.com, I'll send it out to those that request it now. And then when I do my next, mass mailing, emailing, and Facebook announcement and all of that, just before we start Matthew 23 and 24, and again, when we get to starting Revelation chapter 1, I'll be giving you this material again, but you can request it now. Now, these are real simple. There's a blue column on the left, and it's entitled Isaiah. Had to squeeze it to get it all on, this screen for you. But they're nothing but passages, references to Isaiah. The first line has Isaiah 54:5 and chapter 61, verse 10, and again Isaiah chapter 62, verses 4 and 5 and 12, where in the center column on that same line it says husband and bride. Seems to me I read about a husband, a groom, and a bride, a wife, and a marriage supper somewhere else in my Bible. Where was that? Okay. Well, it's in Revelation, third column, chapter 19, verses 7 through 9, and again in chapter 21, verses 2, 9, and 10, and in the intervening verses as the thought is elaborated upon. So Isaiah has 3 chapters with verses that are foretelling some husband and bride getting together. And Revelation's got 2 chapters and quite a few verses right toward the end. They're going to speak about this husband and bride in a great marriage feast. I wonder if Isaiah might be prophesying the same thing that Revelation is. I wonder if Isaiah might have been prophesying something that was far distant from where he stood, but near and soon and shortly to come to pass, when John on Patmos, without any conceivable doubt, sat to write the book of Revelation in the last half of the 60s A.D. under Nero, who put him there, the Syriac version says, rather than Domitian. Then the second line has Isaiah 54:11 and 12. There's a city made of jewels. 54:14 will be free from oppression and fear. 54:15 through 17, all the enemies will be defeated. 49:10, which we read, but again in 55:1 and 58:11 of Isaiah, we have these springs of free water, no cost, come and drink. 56 of Isaiah, verse 5, 62:2, 65:15, all 3 chapters speak of a better and everlasting name that would be coming in the future, according to Isaiah. 56:6 through 8 in Isaiah speaks of foreigners worshiping alongside Jews, the same living God. 58:10 has no darkness or gloom. 60 verse 1 and 2 and verses 19 and 20 have the light of the Lord. Chapter 60 verse 3, the nations come to that light. Chapter 60 verse 10, there are foreign kings that are involved. Verse 11, the gates never close. Verse 14, it's the city of God. In, again, still Isaiah 60, verses 20, it should be an F and not a D, 20 and 21. Chapter 61, verses 2 and 3. And chapter 65, verse 19, mourning, grieving, sorrowing, weeping, lamentation is finished. Chapter 63, verses 1 through 6, there's a wrathful, bloody king in Isaiah foretold. for the future. In Isaiah 66:3, there is a winepress being trampled, foreseen in the future. In Isaiah 65:13, eat, drink, rejoice. In 65:17 and in 66:22, the last two chapters of Isaiah, there's a new heavens and a new earth. And in that 65 verse 18, the next to the last chapter in Isaiah, there's also a new Jerusalem on that new earth under that new heaven, plural heavens. Well, now you got the chart. And you can go down that right column. All of those things, the husband and bride, the city of jewels, the freedom from oppression, the enemies defeated, the springs of water, the better name, the foreigners worshiping, the end of darkness, the light of the Lord, the nations in that light, the foreign kings, the gates never close, the city of God, the end of weeping, the wrathful bloody king, the trampled winepress. Eat, drink, and rejoice. All of our hopes are realized in a new heavens, in a new earth, in a new Jerusalem. You can find in Revelation chapters 19, 21, 20, 7, 22, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 14, chapter 15. You can find it. Chapter 7, chapter 14. Brethren, you can find it everywhere in the book of Revelation. How about we put the two prophecies next to each other, and then we'll say, the New Testament will interpret for us the Old. The Old Testament, it is oft said, is the New Testament concealed. It's a mystery, it's a shadow, it's a type. But the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed, is the end of one of the world's most famous quotes about our 66 books of the Bible. Never truer words were ever spoken. So how about we just take the foretelling of the Old Testament, which was a long way off, the foretelling of the New Testament between brackets in the first chapter, both of which say these things are shortly to come to pass, and we put them alongside each other and we just compare those things and say, well, you know what, it just might be that what was far off in Isaiah's day is just about to happen in John's. Is that somehow ridiculous to think that the New Testament would speak of the shortly to come to pass fulfillment of the Old Testament type? Is it too much to think that the Bible might use the same verbiage in two different testaments to speak of the same events in world history? Is it possible that the descriptive terms of the Old Testament, which refer to the destruction of cities because of their sin, might be speaking of the desolation of God's holy city because it crucified their Messiah, the Son of the living God? If Assyria, if Edom, if Babylon, if Egypt, and they all are spoken of in the Old Testament prophecies, in the imagery that we've read tonight and many more places, and they all speak of God's vengeance on the last days of cities and systems, then is it just possible that the city of Jerusalem and the Mosaic system might be discussed in the same terminology? Well, I've been a carpenter most of my life. I'm going to hold that 16-penny nail and drive that baby right to the head, and a little bit beyond. I hit it so hard. Right under the surface there. That's one well-delivered nail. Brethren, yes, the imagery of the Old Testament just might be revealed to us in more fullness, in more focus in the new. And all we have to do is open our eyes and allow the possibility. This The premillennialist blinds those in allegiance to that system to ever believing. Once they've stripped that possibility away from you, then you know, look for it. You're blind to it. Realized eschatologists do exactly the same thing. Oh, it's not possible that there be any verses in the New Testament that would both speak of the end of Jerusalem, and then a few verses that might just go beyond that. It would speak of things that began at that time and were shortly to start, but did not end at that same time. So, brother, we'll see things that are near, certainly. We'll also see things, I think, in the book of Revelation that haven't come to pass yet. But instead of determining before we read the book that there can't be anything else, or that there must be only this or the other, we're just going to keep our eyes open to both. I don't want to enter Revelation as a realized eschatologist, and I don't want to enter that book as a premillennialist either. I want to enter it like a babe in the woods with a mastery of the Old Testament. I want to enter it like an innocent child. I want to enter it with an open mind. I want to find what's there and not put what I want there in the mouth of John, the angel that gave it to him, or Jesus, whose revelation it was, from the very mind of God. I just don't want to put there what isn't there. I did it for a lot of years. I'm sorry for that. I've had to repent publicly and in the pulpit. You know, if you don't have to do that once in a while, then you're just not growing, are you? Well, let's grow up. I've been wrong. Stuff that I really treasured. Stuff that people I highly respected, taught me. I believe. Some of them went to the grave believing it. Look, I'm not questioning, that a person has necessarily got a hard, evil heart and they're doing it consciously. I suppose that even the Pope thinks he really is the vicar of Christ on earth. It seems highly unlikely, but, maybe. Maybe he actually believes that stuff. Well, it's possible. But the Lord warns us about the wolves in sheep's clothing too. So all I want to do is not wind up in a ditch with a blind false prophet. Because when the blind lead the blind, it's not just the blind man in the lead that winds up in the ditch. It's the guy following him too, who has no excuse for being there. God told us to open our eyes. So let's wrap it up for this evening. It's 8 o'clock. I thank you all so much again. Be inviting your friends to come. Befriend as many people as you can and invite them. I know you got to be a more advanced student. I know this is a serious study. I'm going to treat you like, you're a college level student and you can handle it. Stick with me, baby. The best is yet to come. Y'all have a good night now.